Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Our Experience, an ASCP podcast. It is your host, Tom Hansel, with our co-host, CEO of ASCP, Chad Wers. And together, we're excited to introduce you, if you don't know him already, David Farber. David is a lawyer by trade, and he works with King & Spalding from Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. And the reason why we have David on this podcast is because he's been very integral in everything going on as far as fighting for long-term care pharmacies, fighting for reimbursement. He spends most every day up the Capitol Hill lobbying for our behalf and for our industry's behalf. And so, David, welcome, and thank you for taking time with us. And please tell us a little bit about your background and where you are today.
Shall do. First of all, thanks so much for having me. Really a pleasure to be talking to you today and to continue it's got to be 25-year plus partnership with ASCP. So I'm really delighted that you invited me onto the show. I've got to give you the lawyer's disclaimer before I answer the question. The comments today are my own. They don't represent King & Spalding or my clients or anything like that. These are just my personal views. So with that,
spoken like a true attorney. I like it.
Hey, there you got it. You got to start
disclaimer, by the way. I just represent myself.
There you go. So I'm speaking on behalf of all three of us. So as you mentioned, came to Washington, decades ago. Georgetown law came out and sort of very much went into private practice. Was a litigator for about the first 10 years of my career. And then in about year 10, I had this sort of magical moment where a buddy of mine who I represented on environmental issues at a company, he switched companies, and suddenly he was the general counsel of this small and emerging long-term care pharmacy that you may have heard of. It was this, again, emerging company called Omnicare.
Never heard.
And never heard of it. There you go. And he called me one day and said, "I think we need your help." And in walked a number of long-term care pharmacies all together. I won't bore you with what the issue was then. I really didn't know much about healthcare at the time. Was barely struggling to figure out the differences between Medicare and Medicaid. Some say that that's still true. You'll have to decide for yourself. But I very much was sort of thrown into the deep end of long-term care pharmacy. That very quickly led to putting together an industry association called the Long-Term Care Pharmacy Alliance that existed for about 10 years, was a partner with ASCP on many, many projects. And then LTCPA went away. And a few years later, the SCPC, the Senior Care Pharmacy Coalition, was born. And I worked with that group. And again, we partner with ASCP very closely on all sorts of different issues. And that sort of brings me here today. So I've had the pleasure of watching this industry grow and emerge and morph and change, and have gotten the pleasure of working with and representing many of the companies in the space and many of the associations in the space. And here I am, still holding on.
Yeah, I think it's been a theme of our podcast for a number of people that we have on, to have people with this like breadth of experience in long-term care pharmacy in this space, to be able to give some sort of comment on, what was it like back when Omnicare was emerging and had issues? How has it changed? And to some degree, where is it going? I have to believe there's this complexity to Medicare and even Medicaid, but Medicare probably more primary to us, that makes it difficult for businesses to engage and work with them, and especially if you're making changes or things like that. So you just like, what in your history, like, what is this dynamic like?
Right. So I'll play it forward for you chronologically. I started working with Omnicare in 1999, 1,000 years ago. Might as well have been 1899. And the issues at the time were almost entirely Medicaid. This was before the MMA, before the Part D program, and the name of the game was Medicaid. And, at one point, I think I was suing more state Medicaid programs in the country than any other lawyer. because states were going through budget crunches back in the early 2000s, and the Medicaid line was the largest line in any state budget, and the pharmacy line was the largest line in any state Medicaid budget, and so pharmacy was ripe for budget cuts, and when that happened, it had this outsized impact on long-term care pharmacies. Many of the things and the stuff that we were doing then as an industry are still going on today. I mean, the core services that long-term care pharmacies provide, that model has, in a sense, already been built. It's gotten much better. It's matured significantly. And ASCP is a leader in that. You all know those details better than I. But again, it started with Medicaid. Then the MMA passed, the Medicare Modernization Act of 2003, which created the Part D program. An interesting sort of historical note, we were already actively lobbying Congress to include long-term care pharmacy in the Part D program, to carve it out, to treat it different because of the difference in nature of the services that were provided. Congress had a simple question for us as we were up there advocating. The question was, what's a long-term care pharmacy? It wasn't an unfair question 25 years ago, right? Or 20 years ago. The industry really was emerging. It's nowhere in scale what it is today. And interestingly, you see what we may touch on this later. If you look back at the Medicare Modernization Act, there's a few references to long-term care pharmacy in the Part D statute, which of course today is like our entire world. But there are very few references. But in a section of that law, it's actually not part of the Part D statute. Congress instructs Medicare to conduct a study to define what long-term care pharmacy is, and that was the Lewin study of 2006, 2005, 2006. And that study has sort of sat there, helping define and shape federal policy since. But back in those earlier days, as I call them now, the question on the table is, what are you? What do you do? Why do you do what you do? And I remember very vividly, relying on some of the ASCP Foundation's studies. The name is escaping me now.
Fleetwood.
I'm sorry?
Fleetwood.
But yes, the Fleetwood studies.
Yeah.
Thank you very mumuch. Relying on those studies to say, look, this is what we do, and this is why it's so important, and this is why it really matters for seniors, in the long-term care sector, to get these services and to avoid all the drug misadventures that can happen without the comprehensive services that LTC pharmacy provides. But Congress, couldn't quite wrap its head around it. Suddenly the bill was moving fast. Out comes the Part D program, which today takes over our lives, and Congress is still struggling to define what is a long-term care pharmacy. So you have the Lewin study, and then that feeds a whole bunch of other stuff that really has been embedded in guidance, in the Part D manual, and that's evolved over the years. So it's been quite the ride, and here we are today, with a sector that continues to grow, but faces no shortage of challenges, particularly most recently by the IRA, the Medicare drug price negotiations, which I think is going to have an outsized impact on long-term care pharmacy. I'll talk about that. But it's certainly been an evolution, both as the industry has grown and as policymakers have caught up to that growth, understood the importance of that growth and the meaningfulness of the services, and how that translates into policy today. So sorry for the long answer to the short question.
No, that's great.
No, it just caused me to have about 10 other questions.
Yeah,
but,
right.
Because there's so much packed in there, and but going back to the Medicare Modernization Act, really, I think their definition of what a nursing home patient is was even narrow, because they put them in a skilled building and really didn't include that ALF group. And now we have 50 million seniors that are seniors and need that type of care, but they're never going to be in an institutionalized setting, and so hence the ongoing fight. So I know that we've been talking a lot about long-term care definition, but back to your comment about they started to define that but never really did, or what a long-term care pharmacy is. Can you tell us kind of, I know that's been like digging a ditch to China with a wooden spoon, but can you tell me kind of where that stands right now and if there's any hope that that's actually going to happen this year maybe?
Sure. Well, the good news is we may have been thinking with a wooden spoon, but we're almost there. Look, there is pending legislation in Congress. Well, actually, not even pending in Congress right now, but there was pending legislation in Congress last session, House and Senate bills that would define long-term care pharmacy in statute, and recognize, and create a statutory definition of the term. Part of the problem, just to unpack it, was whether you agree with or disagree with what Medicare has done in terms of its definition. There is a one-line definition in Part D regulations. There's much more expansive guidance in Part D manual and some sub-regulatory guidance beyond that. And we can talk about the merits or missing pieces of all that. But whatever you think it is, it's not in the statute. And we've experienced over the years something that SCPC and ASCP worked on together with the FDA, for example, when they were redoing their repackaging guidance. Well, long-term care pharmacy does a ton of repackaging, right? Almost everything we do is repackaging drugs. And FDA, when we went to them, said, well, what's a long-term care pharmacy?
Right.
Where do we find a definition of it, right? I think you were there. Jed, and we heard this question together, and they asked the CMS, and CMS said, there is no statutory definition, right? That's something we got to solve. It was a question that Congress didn't know how to answer in 2003. Well, it knows how to answer it now. We have, 20 years of history behind us, and so I am pretty optimistic that unless the dysfunction of Congress discussion, that could take up its own hour.
Right.
But unless that completely overwhelms the process, if there are, is healthcare legislation that's going to get passed this year, hopefully that definition bill will be in it. So I think we're close. There's a discussion if that's possibly can happen in March. 3 days ago I might have said yes. Today I'm feeling a little more skeptical given the complete breakdown in political Washington around the bipartisan border bill and the bipartisan tax bill, right? That the House and Senate can't seem to communicate over, and the politics that are taking over the process, the legislative process, much earlier in the election year than is normally the case. We see this kind of behavior in June and July. Now we're seeing it in January, February. So setting aside the political dysfunction, if legislation is to advance in the healthcare sector, and there is reason for hope, I am cautiously optimistic that we are going to get that definition bill into law. To solve those problems and be able to answer the FDA and other agencies and Congress itself when it's trying to regulate. Support Act is a great example. CARA before that, the opioid abuse laws, where long-term care pharmacy needed to be treated a different way. And everyone was like, yeah, we agree with you. Where do we find the definition of long-term care pharmacy? We need that definition. So
I have a couple quick rebuttal questions, and then I have a sort of a pivot question. But the rebuttal questions is, just from your experience, does a healthcare bill in this environment have a better shot than a border bill, or does it not matter? I mean, just intuitively, you'd think we have a lot more bipartisan support for healthcare bills than maybe we do on the border bill, but does that mean anything?
So in one sense, you're right. The politics around healthcare bills are much less heated than around border issues, and potentially around tax issues as well. Right? Everybody's focused today and yesterday on this border bill that was sort of a requirement to pass the overseas supplemental legislation to provide aid for Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan and a few other places. We had to have border relief as part of that. Now that we have a bipartisan border bill, everybody's saying, we can't agree to a bipartisan border bill. We got to move away from that. Yes, the politics around that are ugly, but you need those pieces to fit together for the healthcare bills to ride along with them. And it's not just a long-term care pharmacy definition.
Sure.
there's lots and lots of backed up healthcare policy that the Congress just hasn't gotten to, but knows it needs to address. Home infusion is another good example, something we've worked on together in different contexts. I just, as one call out, but there's dozens and dozens of issues. Good policy, bipartisan, that need to get done. But the politics needs to connect for these, packages to get through. And that's very, very difficult to do. So I think that although the politics of the specific issues are different, they all tend to mesh together and either create an environment where Congress is able to pass legislation or it's not. And unfortunately, we're in the it's not phase, or it's really not phase, which is a new level of dysfunction that we haven't seen in quite a while.
Yeah. Back to your comments on, what is a long-term care pharmacy? I do feel like, and I've only been in this role for coming up on 6 years, that every conversation with every agency and government official started with, what is long-term care pharmacy? I don't know what it is. I think in some ways our experience with COVID eased that a little bit. We were so prominent in the response to COVID that I think some of those conversations, particularly with agencies, they now kind of recognize, yes, there are these pharmacies that service nursing homes that helped us a lot during COVID. I remember that. You might have to remind me a little bit, but I'm not starting from ground zero. So I think that's helpful. And I think that provides some, whatever layer of recognition when a bill like this comes forward, that yes, we understand what that is. Let's get that done. So I'm hopeful from that perspective. How do you look at Medicare as a animal that, it reacts to things in certain ways? It's always reacted to where a person puts their head down as a setting. Like, you put your head down in a SNF, so here's a bunch of rules about nursing facilities. You put your head down in an assisted living, we don't really touch that. So there's, a set of rules that may not be as government focused as market focused. You set your head down at home, you're entitled to certain things. How do we get Medicare to recognize the person as the center of that care, to whereas, I could be, a 78-year-old person living at home with 5 comorbidities, and I need IV meds and all these services, and I should have access to the same kinds of things that the person that's 78 years old that lives in a nursing home gets. So how do we create that parity and that opportunity for pharmacies and pharmacists to participate with these patients that are probably in every bit in need of their services, but because they put their head down in a different place, they don't get offered those services?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the only answer is it's trench warfare, and we've got to be in this for the long haul. Think of the structure of the Medicare statute. It is very much location-based, picking up on your analogy, right? You have the inpatient statute that was passed in 1 year with its own distinct reimbursement system and its own distinct requirements for who is considered inpatient. We call that 2 midnight rule today, right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't there for many years. Then there was, a few years later, there was the outpatient statute, right? And that's a complete hospital outpatient and ambulatory surgery centers. Completely different paradigm, completely different eligibility requirements, completely different payment system, right? Those two don't even talk to each other. And then you have physician office, and then you have long-term care. So this entire statute for the last 40 years has been location-centric. There have been efforts to shift the system, and I would argue not terribly successfully, to the provider, give the provider control, the whole ACO model, right? We're going to, take the doctor, and they're going to be responsible, or the hospital, and they're going to be responsible for all care for that particular patient, no matter where they go, right? And we'll give them upsides and downsides, et cetera. I always often point to the Maryland model. Maryland is on this waiver model from inpatient. Hospitals are, when someone checks into a hospital in Maryland, hospitals require for all the care. So hospitals in Maryland, have many more urgent care centers that they own because they need to control the community care, right? They have better relationships with physicians, but even that system doesn't work particularly well, right? When you try to do it on a statewide basis, which was the Maryland example for years. So we obviously are not succeeding today in the Medicare program with a location-centric system, I'm not sure that the provider system really works, right? Either the ACO model, which we've been working with for a decade at this point, with MIPA and the MIP system, and the Maryland model. There are many other examples you can point to, but it's not really thriving and taking over the Medicare program, much less healthcare as we know it today. So how do we get to a patient-based system to look at the needs of the patient and figure out the right inputs, irrespective of where that patient happens to be? And I think that that's going to be a real challenge, because we're trying to move a system that for 40 years has been, or 50 years has been, so location-centric. And now we've got to shift the paradigm. But it's worth the fight.
Yeah.
And I think that long-term care pharmacy proves the point.
Well, I think we're seeing an example of this in the PACE programs, right, which are Medicaid or state ran, but the provider is fully at risk, and they're responsible for that patient. That patient goes to the ER, that provider has to pay for it. That patient goes to a nursing home, that provider has to pay for it. But if they can keep them at home and keep them healthy at home, then it certainly seems to be the outcome-based model that I believe is working, and more Medicaid programs are adding PACE or growing their PACE. I know we don't have a federal PACE program, but to me that seems to be a model for that long-term care home patient that we can adapt.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lessons from that model. I think, to David's point, we're not doing it well really anywhere. So how do we pivot this giant system that's used to doing it a certain way? How do we pivot it so that it starts working well? And I don't know that we have answers to that. And it is an uphill battle to change, how it looks at a person versus a person's location. So let me ask a follow-up question to that. For 25 years, we have not seen growth in skilled nursing home, the licensing of skilled nursing home beds. They move around, facility closes, sells, a bigger facility might pick up those beds and drop them into their facility. But by and large, there's been the same 1.7 million skilled nursing home beds across the country for 25 years. That, in the face of the population growth, tells you that the person that was admitted to a nursing home 15 years ago probably doesn't get admitted to a nursing home today. That 1.7 million beds, I usually use parking places. Maybe that's not a appropriate term, but there's only so many parking places. Those parking places have to be used by the most severely disabled or comorbid patients, because that's the only place they can go to get care, 24/7 care, which means it squeezes out people with maybe less sophistication, still may require that kind of service, but now you have to do it some other way, right, in this hospitality model that is AL or at home. How do those things rectify? Do we start building more nursing homes, which I can't believe anybody has a desire to do, because they're expensive. People don't like to go to they don't want to go to a nursing home. What happens first? More nursing home beds, or a change in how we look at the reimbursement for patients that might need advanced services?
I think it's the latter. I mean, the shift. I lived through the shift from nursing homes to assisted living facilities.
Yeah.
I grew up in Bronx in New York, a few miles away from one of those beautiful nursing homes, that you've ever imagined, the Hebrew Home in Riverdale.
I've been there.
Right.
I've walked through there
all the time. Right. It is a spectacular place. Right. But still, none of us really want to end up even in that magnificent
You're right.
Set of buildings. Right. And the reality is that nursing homes today are far from, where me and my elementary school went to sing with the school choir, or where you and your elementary school went to sing with the school choir. Right. The ambulatory patients just aren't there. We've created this whole state-based, and I hope it stays state-based, system of ALFs, and that's going to continue on. I mean, we're going to segment the market. So I don't think that the number of beds particularly grows, or we start building more homes, even if we could build more Hebrew homes like in Riverdale. But the reality is that those beds today aren't fully occupied.
Right.
Right. What's COVID occupancy rates really dropped. Maybe we're back to pre-COVID levels, but we're at 80-85%. So we're not even using all those beds, because we have assisted living, and many patients aren't that in such a desperate and acute need that they need full SNF care. And that's great. And that just leads us back to keeping more people at home. There's always, we could go back to Olmsted, but, there's always been this emphasis. Today, particularly with remote monitoring technologies and all sorts of other stuff, it's a much more viable possibility, which creates the need for patients taking 12, 14, 16 drugs, at a time, to absolutely have long-term care pharmacy at their side. And that's the real challenge, for all of us now in breaking through those barriers. We've succeeded somewhat in the last few years. I mean, the Medicare memo to the Part D plans, in December of 2021, saying that patients with an institutional level of care need, deserve long-term care pharmacy no matter where they are.
Right.
That's a big step forward, and we just got to continue to build on that.
Yeah, no, certainly, and that December memo was important, and I think I have it on my refrigerator at home. We certainly are excited about it, but at the end of the day, is the payer's not going to pay, right, until they have to, and so that's what you and ASCP have been fighting for, and I think long-term care pharmacies are resistant, to put it mildly, to go even service these patients because their reimbursement's not at that long-term care skilled, nursing level. What's it going to take for even us? Do we have to go out and just hope for the best and maybe someday the reimbursement's going to be there? Or is there something else that we can hold on to say, hey, that reimbursement's really not that far away? I've got both sides of the fence here. Some people believe it's never going to happen, and some people think it's going to happen, Tuesday. So, I know it's going to eventually happen, but I'm not quite sure when. From all the actions and activities that you have, do you think there's a legitimate pathway that we are going to see similar reimbursements for a long-term care patient who qualifies as a long-term care patient? Does this happen to be residing at home?
Right. So I'll quote a good friend of mine who, in her earlier life, ran a big chunk of the Medicaid program. And she always says, right, in God we trust, all others bring data.
Yeah.
Right. And that, I think, is going to be the game changer here. We know the number, and I harken back to the Fleetwood studies, right? We know the data, right? We know, the cost savings that long-term care pharmacy brings to the system for the right patient who needs that level of service. And we know there are millions of them at home now. We need data, and lots of it. Right. And SCPC is working on that. ASCP is working on that. We need much better studies, not just in the Medicare Advantage population, although that's a great start. Right. There's some recent studies out there in that sector. Right. But we need more comprehensive data to be able to go to the payers. It's something that, frankly, the agency will help us on, but there's only so far it can go, particularly in given the structure of the Part D program, the non-interference clause. I don't want to go all legal here, but the agency can build the infrastructure, but they can't force the plans to pay. But if we walk into the plans with 5, 10 studies that say for everybody, for every patient who looks like this, or a group of patients who look like, this cohort, we can deliver real ROI, to the payers. If you simply pay us to provide the necessary long-term care pharmacy services, that's the winning proposition. But we don't have that library of data right now, and I think that's what we need to build, right? And to any pharmacy who's out there, or any pharmacist who's out there, start thinking about what kind of data you can put together and where you can get that data published. I'm not talking about McKnight's, love them as I do. We need, peer-reviewed literature level, or grade 1 data to be able to build our case, because that's what chief medical officers respond to. We can persuade the chief medical officer. We can then get the payers to actually start paying us. It's happening in places. We're all tracking that. It's nowhere near enough, but the possibility is very much there. We build that database. We have that library of articles. I think that we can begin to build the case, as we did, frankly, in the SNF world and the ALF world.
Yeah.
Right? Those payers get it.
Yeah.
They don't get it because the government beat it over their heads. The government helped. That is there. Let's build it at home.
Do you think there's to go back to another comment you made about assisted living and it being state-based? Some people would say that it's an environment for people that are not your typical nursing home patient. They're not Medicaid, Medicare. They're affluent enough to afford it. There are some state waiver programs where Medicaid recipients can get into AL. Do you think that leads to the federal government investing in AL in some capacity and sort of, and I'm not going to say turning it into skilled nursing, but creating another location that they have different payment models for, because they realize we've got to have places for these patients to go that don't require them to pay out of pocket, because that doesn't serve everybody. Do you see that? Or do you see it staying state-based?
Right. I do see it seeing state-based, not because of the payer mix and how, and that patients and ALFs are mostly private pay and can afford to pay, or can afford to pay to a point, and, and then what happens to them, a whole other conversation. But I think that the federal government would really struggle to come up with the money to start seriously paying, regulating and paying for ALF patients. It's almost sort of a budget, question, and they're very big dollars.
Yeah.
So I just can't see the feds getting involved in the state-based system. But in a sense, if I may push back on the question, in our world, the feds are already in the state-based system.
Yeah.
Part D plans cover drugs in ALFs as much as they do in SNFs and as much as they do at home. So, we should stop thinking about, there's no federal imprint in the ALF system, right? In our world of pharmacy, it's already there, and it's been there from the beginning.
Right.
Since 2006. So, I challenge us to rethink, that state federal bifurcation. Not true in our world. Feds are there and have been.
So let me pivot over to IRA. You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act earlier in our conversation. What do you believe that's going to have as far as an impact on long-term care pharmacies? I know, the sky's falling and we're all, running around, but it's 2 years away, and knowing our industry, we're gonna pivot. We're gonna pivot a lot, but my belief is that government's really not going to get the savings that they assumed or calculated they were going to get, because we will pivot, because some of these drugs will come out generic. There'll be new brands and those type of things. But what's your take on the IRA, the impact it's going to have on our industry, long-term care pharmacy specifically?
So, I do think the sky is falling, and I think we need to start running around, or keep on running around. We need to keep on running around faster. Look, everybody's focused on these first 10 drugs, and 8 of the 10 drugs subject to price negotiation right now. Unless the litigation succeeds, my firm is representing the plaintiffs in 2 of those cases. We have a chamber case and the Novo case, right? And I hope my colleagues very much succeed. But it's not about the 8 drugs that are heavily used in long-term care that are in this first round, right? That's 2026. Imagine you're in 2032, right? And now we have 100, the top 100 most expensive drugs, where the vast majority of, and I'll say it very bluntly, of margin for any pharmacy, much less any long-term care pharmacy, is, right? We know the reality that on very inexpensive generics, given where dispensing fees are, they are losses for a long-term care pharmacy. Every time you put out, one of those low-cost generics, pharmacy's losing money. It's just a reality. And the only way for long-term care pharmacies, which don't have a front of store like retail, to survive is margin on the higher price branded drugs. And if all those drug prices or 70, 80% of branded drugs that are in the 10% that we actually dispense, because generic utilization is way high in long-term care pharmacy, something we should be very proud of, right? But if the revenue and any of the net profit comes from those branded drugs, and suddenly all those prices are going down 60%. And by law, we are required to turn those drugs into pass-throughs, right? The manufacturer has to offer the drug at the negotiated price to the pharmacy, who has to sell the drug to the beneficiary at the negotiated price, right? It's just a pass-through. No pharmacy will make a penny on any of the eight of the 10 heavily utilized drugs in long-term care pharmacy in 2026. But again, fast forward to when that number of 10 is now 100 or 120 or 150. If the program succeeds, I think there will be radical drug price drops. You're right. There's going to be a lot of generic influx. We're beginning to see that already. Some of the manufacturers are inviting generic competition before exclusivity is over. Not in an authorized generic way, in a pure generic way. We'll see how that all plays out. And there will be shifts in formulary utilization, away from some of these now less expensive drugs to perhaps less effective, but more expensive drugs, right? Completely upside down and a likely unintended consequence of the IRA. But the business threat to the entire sector, long-term care pharmacy and pharmacy writ large, has not really been fully fleshed out yet. I think it's very real. SEPC is studying that intensely right now. I think that we are going to need to figure out a different model. If that is the way the federal government is going in the Part D program, which it is. So, at least this administration is dead set. There was a wonderful video put out by the new chief of competition, a new position in the secretary's office at HHS, doubling down on price negotiation. Now that just a few days ago, the government, put its first offers out to the pharma companies that are unlucky enough to make the top 10 list. But this is something that the government is very committed to. There's going to be a massive unintended consequence on pharmacy. We need to start understanding it now and coming up with policy solutions that we can then get implemented. Otherwise, this industry is in for a world of hurt in about 3-4 years, and maybe much sooner.
Yeah, it's definitely a threat. I don't know. I don't have any good responses for that. I don't know. I think like a lot of us, we're trying to see what impact it's going to have, trying to figure out, looking ahead, what is this impact going to be? What are the price negotiations going to look like? There's a piece of me that feels like the way it was constructed that has some, if you were really intent on lowering drug prices, it has some flaws. Like the drug has to be around for 9 years before it can be subject to this, which to me, for any new drug, changes the game for that new drug. The new drug is going to come out and price itself with this model in mind. They're going to say, I've got 9 years to recoup this. So it's going to come out knowing that in 9 years, I'm going to be before the FDA or before the negotiators, and I'm going to have to negotiate to whatever these first negotiations start looking like. Just don't know. I think there's a lot of unknowns. Like, what does that mean? What will that mean?
Yeah.
We'll have these really high priced drugs, and then we'll have these ones that have been price controlled, and then we'll have generics. It's hard to say.
But we're going to have to figure out on our own,
Yeah.
assuming that it's going to go through and assuming that we're not going to be able to make any changes in Congress. I mean, even like rebates, these are the most rebatable drugs.
Sure.
I think Eliquis alone is probably 50% of a long-term care pharmacy's rebate. Just one drug is 50% of their revenue. And so it's going to require innovation on our part as far as the pharmacies, because we can't rely on the government making a change or pulling it.
Yeah, and I have some different ideas on that too, because I will also say some of those products, particularly in long-term care, have been underutilized. So there's space for them to be utilized more effectively, better for the patients, like in place of warfarin. Warfarin's still 50% of the skilled nursing home space, which is
hard to believe.
Cheap, but we should be using more Eliquis. We should be using more Xarelto. So if we ramp up the appropriate utilization, even in the face of a negotiated price, what does that mean? Do we mediate it, or is it worse, or is it better? I don't think we know.
And the same conversation is happening at the wholesalers and at
100%.
the PBMs, right? And at the
all these people that take a cut.
I mean,
my guess is the PBMs are going to figure it out. We'll see. Yeah.
But it's something we've got to worry about, and I think now is the time to really be focusing on that.
Yeah.
Formulary substitution can only get you so far. Bringing new drugs to market, there's only going to be so much of that.
True.
It's neither of them is going to be a solution here, and there's going to be an economic hit. We need to come to terms with that very quickly. Come up with the policy solutions. Part of the answer, I think, is looking at dispensing fees. Why is Medicaid paying $10 to $12 dispensing fees, whereas Part D is paying far less than that.
100%.
You know, when you look at some of the Part B dispensing fees that were statutorily mandated in certain select drugs, including insulin, and they're much, much higher.
Yeah.
Right? You know, to which GAO says, well, why are we overpaying in Part B when Part D is so much lower? There's an answer to that question.
Right.
Right? But you know, there's got to be a fair dispensing fee. It's something that the plans of the PPMs have gotten away with for a long time. And I think that's got to change.
I 100% agree. I think that is a priority, is to figure that out and to figure out how that applies to pharmacies operating in different settings. What's a community dispensing fee? What's a long-term care dispensing fee for a SNF resident or maybe somebody that requires advanced services in a different setting?
Yeah.
Right. Or what are the services that we are providing to a particular patient, and will we get an appropriate dispensing fee, you know, that covers those services? It could be two patients in beds next to each other, but one has that acuity or institutional level of need, the other one doesn't. You know, we ought to make sure that the right dispensing fee for the right patient.
Yeah.
And even if someone literally in the bed next to them doesn't need those services, different dispensing fee. I'm good with that.
Yeah.
Right? We're only asking to be paid for what we're doing.
Right. It's the outcome based. So, David, as we close up here, any predictions on the presidential election that you want to throw out there?
Wow.
6 months earlier?
Wow.
No.
Well, you have a disclaimer, so whatever you say is completely off the record. So,
yeah, except on this podcast. No, I mean, look, this election has already proven to be crazy. We just got the decision by the D.C. Circuit today that President Trump is not immune from criminal prosecution. And the Supreme Court's going to be asked to hear that. You know, how is that going to affect the timing of these cases? How, you know, our independents in the country, who are a growing number, because everybody's so disgusted with the two major parties, how are the independents going to vote? There's a long way between, you know, February 6th and Election Day.
Yeah.
So, you know, even if I were foolish enough to venture a prediction, you know, I would call you back tomorrow and change it, and again and again and again, and you don't want to hear from me that often. So, it is a toss-up. You know, we could take a stab at the Senate and the House, of which, you know, the conventional wisdom is both flip. I think that's pretty true in the Senate. I think we'll see what this special election in Brooklyn, Swazi versus Phillip, looks like it's much closer than folks would have imagined to fill that seat. You know, in a million years, we would have thought Brooklyn, the Democrats have this, may be much closer than we expect. So I think that'll be an early warning indicator. Brooklyn is a very mixed demographic, and far less of a Democratic stronghold than it was, which is an early predictor of what some places in the country are like. But on the other hand, you have places like Iowa and New Hampshire, early primary and caucus states still today, that may be less predictive of the outcome, even though they're driving the results within the parties. So it's quite complicated, and it's a little easier to predict where the House and Senate are going to go. As to the president, no clue.
Well, just a quick question on, let's just assume that you're right, that the Senate flips, the House flips. Does that mean more of the same in terms of these battles on legislation, particularly healthcare legislation? Does it favor one side or the other if the two houses flip, or what should we be rooting for, I guess, if we want real reform in the system?
Yeah, I think it's really driven at the presidential level,
yeah.
and that's the answer to the question. I mean, the Trump factor here cannot be underestimated. This whole bipartisan border deal that we were talking about earlier, right? And I realize people listening to this podcast a month from now won't have a clue what we're talking about because it's all going to evaporate, right? But this bipartisan border deal that senators spent months hammering out, got the bipartisan agreement, and then Trump blew it up in 24 hours. If that continues on,
yeah.
if Trump is elected president, yeah, it's going to be much more of the same. If Trump is not elected president, harder to predict, what the future holds. And, the emails going around today are Congress is dead. right? The legislation is dead. There's no possibility to get anything done this year. I'm not so sure about that. I hold out great hopes for December. Again, it's only February, so it's a little early to do that. But maybe just because, I want to have some corner of optimism somewhere.
Right.
That I keep on saying, wait for December. But we really won't know for a while. There is a very real risk that we continue on the path that we're on, which from I believe in policy and good policy and Congress being functional. I think that there's a role for Congress in this country, and it's just been a disaster to watch as Congress is is literally eating itself and harming the country in the process. So I hope we get back on track, although it's hard to see how we really get there.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for being on today and sharing your opinion. I know it's just your opinion, but thank you, because we value your opinion. And thanks for giving us the time today and talking to us about all these issues. Appreciate it.
And I want to
really my pleasure.
And I want to recognize those posters behind you, the Nutcracker posters behind you. There's a little story behind that.
Yeah, well, thank you for the shout out. The dancer and the posters. There's another one there, and there's another one over there. But they're my oldest daughter, who's the principal dancer in the Dallas Fort Worth company. So anybody listening in Dallas Fort Worth, go to the ballet and shoot me a note, and I'll get you backstage.
There you go.
So maybe not backstage, but at least to the stage door to meet the principal dancer.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
but we're very proud of my daughter. Right? It's obvious that I would give birth to a dancer like that.
I was
Right?
going to say.
Of course. No, really a pleasure being with you both. Thank you for the opportunity again, and to be continued.
All right. Thanks, David. All right, everybody.
Okay.
We'll see you next time on our next episode of Our Experience.